The Texas sun had turned cruel by 3 in the afternoon, baking the red dirt until it cracked like broken promises. Heat waves shimmered off the asphalt highway that cut through Cedar Valley like a scar, and even the buzzards had given up circling, seeking shade wherever they could find it. But it wasn't the heat that made Ben Carter's hands shake as he gripped the steering wheel of his dusty Ford pickup. It was the blood. Not his blood. Not yet. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But blood all the same, dried dark on the dashboard where desperate fingers had clawed for purchase just hours before. Blood that belonged to a girl barely old enough to vote, carrying a secret that would either save 2 lives or end them all. Blood that told a story Ben Carter wasn't sure he was ready to hear, but one he knew he couldn't walk away from. Not anymore. The radio crackled with static, then Deputy Morrison's voice cut through. "Ben, you copy? Got reports of a disturbance out your way. Everything all right at Iron Creek?" Ben stared at the microphone, knowing that once he answered, there would be no going back. No more hiding behind grief. No more pretending he didn't care what happened. Beyond his property line. The blood on his dashboard had already made that choice for him. "Yeah, Jake," he finally answered, his voice rougher than the gravel road beneath his tires. "Everything's just fine." It was the first lie he'd told in 3 years. It wouldn't be the last. The morning had started like any other at Iron Creek Ranch. Ben Carter rose before dawn not because he wanted to, but because sleeping past 5 meant lying in bed with memories that cut deeper than barbed wire. 3 years of the same routine had worn grooves in his soul. Coffee black as his mood, check the cattle, mend whatever the Texas heat had broken the day before, and avoid looking at the locked door at the end of the hallway. The door that still held the scent of baby powder and unfulfilled dreams. Ben was a man carved from the same limestone that jutted up from his pastures, weathered by loss until only the hardest parts remained. At 52, his hair had gone silver at the temples, and his blue eyes held the distant look of someone who'd seen too much and saved too little. The badge he'd worn for 15 years as Cedar Valley sheriff now gathered dust in a drawer, traded for the simpler problems of cattle and drought. Cattle didn't ask questions you couldn't answer. Drought didn't blame you for not being there when it mattered most. He'd been checking the south fence line when he first heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the symphony of cicadas and distant lowing of his Herefords. An engine, pushed too hard, growing closer. Ben shaded his eyes against the glare and watched a battered Honda Civic bounce down his private road, trailing dust and desperation in equal measure. The car lurched to a stop near his front porch, steam rising from under the hood like prayers from burning churches. The driver's door opened, and what emerged wasn't what Ben had expected. She was young, maybe 19, with the kind of beauty that had been carved away by fear until only determination remained. Her dark hair hung in tangled waves around shoulders that trembled despite the heat, and her clothes looked like she'd slept in them for days. But it was her eyes that stopped Ben cold, brown eyes that held the weight of someone who'd witnessed things that couldn't be unseen. She stumbled toward him, and that's when he saw the bundle in her arms. Tiny fists poked out from a yellow blanket, and the soft mewling sound of a newborn carried across the dusty yard. The girl nearly fell, caught herself against the porch railing, and looked up at Ben with a desperation that reached right through his chest and squeezed his heart. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracked with exhaustion and something deeper. "Are you the rancher? Please, we need help." Ben found himself moving without thinking, his body remembering instincts he'd tried to bury. He caught her elbow as she swayed, felt how thin she'd become, how her skin burned with fever and fear. Up close, he could see the purple bruises on her throat, the split lip that was trying to heal, the way she held the baby like it was the last good thing left in the world. "Easy now," he said, his voice gentler than he'd heard it in years. Let's get you both inside before this heat kills us all." She nodded, tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "My name is Maria Santos," she said as he guided her toward the door. "This is my sister Rosa. She's only 3 weeks old." Ben paused with his hand on the screen door. Sister, not daughter. That meant someone else's blood had created this child. Someone else's love had brought her into the world. Someone else's. Hate was now hunting her. "What kind of help are you looking for, Maria?" She looked back toward the road, as if expecting to see pursuit already cresting the hill. When she turned back to him, her voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more power than any shout could have. "The kind that keeps us alive until tomorrow." The interior of Ben's ranch house hadn't seen a woman's touch in 3 years. And it showed. The furniture was functional but sparse, chosen for durability rather than comfort. Family photos had been turned face down or removed entirely, leaving pale rectangles on the walls like ghosts of happier times. The air conditioning hummed steadily, fighting against the relentless Texas heat, and the sudden coolness made Maria gasp with relief. Ben guided her to the leather couch that dominated his living room, the same couch where he'd once fallen asleep watching late-night movies with Sarah, where little Tommy had built his Lego cities and declared them safe from all monsters. Now, it would serve a different purpose, shelter for different refugees from different monsters. "Water first," Ben said, moving toward the kitchen with the efficiency of someone accustomed to handling emergencies. "Then we talk." While he filled a glass from the filtered pitcher in his refrigerator, he studied Maria through the pass-through window. She'd unwrapped the baby partially, checking her tiny face with the practiced concern of someone who'd been caring for an infant alone. The child was beautiful, with her sister's dark hair and skin the color of café con leche. But she was too thin, and her breathing seemed slightly labored in the way that spoke of stress and inadequate care. "She needs formula," Maria said without looking up. "I've been trying to nurse her, but I'm not producing enough milk. I've been giving her sugar water, but I know that's not good for her." Ben returned with the water and watched Maria drain half the glass in one desperate gulp. Her hands shook as she set it down, and he noticed the dirt caked under her fingernails, the way her clothes hung loose on a frame that had lost too much weight too quickly. "There's a store in town," he said. "Helen Rodriguez keeps baby supplies. I can drive over and get what you need." "No," the word came out sharp, panicked. "Please don't leave us alone, not yet." "He might come." Ben settled into the recliner across from her, the same chair where he'd once read bedtime stories, and helped with homework. Now it would be his command post for whatever war was coming to his doorstep. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Tell me about he." Maria's arms tightened around baby Rosa, and for a moment, Ben thought she might not answer. Then the words began to pour out like water through a broken dam, carrying with them all the pain and horror she'd been holding. "Back, my father, Carlos Santos. He owns a construction company in San Antonio, employs maybe 30 men. To everyone in our neighborhood, he's this respected businessman, goes to mass every Sunday, gives money to the church. But at home," she paused, touching the fading bruises on her throat. "At home, he rules like we're his property." Ben had seen enough domestic violence cases during his years as sheriff to recognize the pattern. But something in Maria's voice suggested this went deeper than typical abuse. "My mother, Elena, she had 3 miscarriages after me. 3 times she lost babies, and each time my father grew angrier. He wanted sons, said daughters were curses that brought shame to a family. Said God was punishing him for some sin by only giving him females." Maria's voice grew bitter. "But when Mama got pregnant again at 43, he was sure this time would be different. This time God would give him the son he deserved." Rosa stirred in her arms, making small sounds that weren't quite cries but suggested hunger and discomfort. Maria adjusted the blanket, her movements automatic and protective. When Rosa was born 3 weeks ago, my father lost his mind. He screamed at the doctors, accused them of lying, said they must have switched the babies. When they brought us home from the hospital, he wouldn't even look at her. Called her an abomination, said she was proof that our family was cursed. Ben felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same feeling he'd gotten when working cases involving children. The helpless anger at adults who visited their failures and disappointments on the innocent. Where's your mother now, Maria? The question hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire, and Ben already knew the answer from the way Maria's face crumpled. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. 4 days ago, he came home drunk and angrier than I'd ever seen him. Started ranting about how this was all Mama's fault, how she must have done something to anger God, how she'd brought shame on the Santos name. He kept saying Rosa wasn't his blood, couldn't be his blood, because Santos men made sons, not daughters. She paused to take a shuddering breath, and Ben waited, knowing that rushing would only cause her to shut down. He'd learned that patience was often the difference between getting the truth and getting silence. Mama was in the kitchen making his dinner, trying to stay out of his way like she always did when he got like that. But he followed her, kept yelling about how she'd failed him, how she'd brought this curse into his house. I was in my room with Rosa, trying to keep her quiet so she wouldn't make him angrier. Maria's voice broke completely then, and the tears came in earnest. Ben found himself leaning forward, every instinct he'd developed as both a lawman and a father urging him to offer comfort. But he also knew she needed to get this out, needed someone to witness the truth she'd been carrying alone. I heard the noise from the kitchen, this terrible crash, like dishes breaking. Then silence. I waited for maybe 5 minutes, hoping he'd just stormed out like he sometimes did. But when I went to check, she closed her eyes, as if she could block out the memory. Mama was on the floor, there was blood everywhere. The cast iron skillet was beside her head, and she wasn't moving. Ben's hands clenched into fists without his conscious permission. He'd seen the aftermath of domestic violence too many times. But it never got easier. The waste of it, the senseless brutality visited on those who could least defend themselves. He was just standing there, looking down at her like he was surprised by what he'd done. When he saw me in the doorway, he said, "Look what she made me do. Look what happens when women don't know their place." Then he looked at Rosa in my arms and said, "That thing dies tonight. No daughter of mine brings this kind of shame to my family." Maria pulled Rosa closer, as if the memory alone could summon danger. I ran, grabbed the diaper bag and the car keys and ran. I drove all night, didn't even know where I was going. I just knew I had to get Rosa away from him, had to find somewhere safe. Ben stood and walked to the window, looking out at his peaceful ranch where cattle grazed under the afternoon sun, and the biggest danger was usually rattlesnakes or flash floods. It was hard to reconcile this tranquil scene with the horror Maria had just described. "How did you find me?" "There's a truck stop about 50 miles south of here." I stopped for gas and to buy formula for Rosa, but I only had $20 left. The clerk was this older woman, must have seen how desperate I looked. When I asked if she knew anywhere I could go, somewhere safe, she said there was a rancher up north who used to be a sheriff. Said if anyone would help someone in trouble, it would be Ben Carter at Iron Creek Ranch. Ben turned back to face her, seeing now how the pieces had fallen into place. A desperate young woman, an innocent child, and a reputation he'd thought was buried along with his badge. Apparently, some things followed you no matter how far you ran. This clerk have a name? Rosa, like my sister. She said she'd met you once when her grandson got in trouble, said you were fair when you didn't have to be. Maria's eyes searched his face. She said you'd understand what it meant to protect family. The words hit Ben like a physical blow, bringing with it the memory of another car ride, another desperate rush to save someone he loved. The difference was, he'd failed that time. Sarah and Tommy had died because he'd been too slow, too late, too consumed with his job to pay attention to what mattered most. But maybe this time could be different. Maybe this time he could be fast enough, smart enough, present enough to make a difference. "Your father," he said, settling back into his chair. "What kind of resources does he have?" "Money, connections, people who might help him track you down." Maria nodded grimly. "He has money, and he knows people all over Texas. Construction workers, truck drivers, people who owe him favors. Plus he has my Uncle Victor, his brother. Victor's been in and out of prison, but he's loyal to my father. If anyone can find us, it's him." "How long do you think before they figure out where you went?" "I don't know. I tried to be careful, paid cash for gas, but I had to use my debit card at one store for formula. If they check my bank records—" She trailed off, the implication clear. Ben calculated distances and drive times in his head. If Carlos Santos had started looking immediately, if he had the resources Maria described, if he was willing to break laws to get what he wanted, then they might have hours, not days. "Maria, I need you to understand something. If your father is as dangerous as you say, if he's willing to kill to get Rosa back, then helping you puts us all at risk. I'm not a sheriff anymore. I don't have backup coming if things go bad." She met his eyes directly, and he saw steel beneath the fear. "I know, but I also know that Rosa will die if I don't find someone willing to stand between her and him. I can't protect her alone. I'm 19 years old. I don't have money or connections or weapons. All I have is the hope that there are still good people in the world." Ben looked at the baby in her arms, this tiny life that had never asked to be born into such violence and hatred. Rosa's eyes were open now, dark and alert, tracking movement with the unfocused attention of the very young. She looked nothing like Tommy, but something in her expression reminded him of his son's absolute trust in the world's goodness. That trust had been shattered on a rainy highway 3 years ago. Maybe it was time to honor it by ensuring another child's trust wasn't broken the same way. "All right," Ben said, the word carrying the weight of a vow. "You can stay. But we do this smart. No more running until we have a plan, no more panic decisions. We prepare for them to come, and when they do, we're ready." Maria sagged with relief, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she looked like the teenager she really was. "Thank you. I promise we won't be any trouble. I can help with chores, cooking, whatever you need." Ben almost smiled at that. As if trouble wasn't already parking itself in his driveway with blood on its hands and murder in its heart. As if he hadn't just signed up for the kind of fight he'd spent 3 years trying to avoid. "First things first," he said, standing and reaching for his keys. "That baby needs proper food, and you need clothes that fit and a decent meal. I'm driving to Rodriguez General Store. Helen's discreet, and she'll have what we need. But what if they come while you're gone?" Ben walked to a closet near the front door and withdrew something that made Maria's eyes widen. It was a shotgun, well-maintained and clearly functional, along with a box of shells. "You ever fire one of these?" Maria shook her head. "Then, we're going to have a quick lesson before I leave. Because Maria Santos, if your father wants to take Rosa from this ranch, he's going to have to go through both of us to do it." As he showed her how to load and aim the weapon, Ben found himself thinking about the locked room at the end of the hall, about the nursery that had been waiting 3 years for a child who would never come home. Maybe it was time to open that door. Maybe it was time to let life back into spaces that had been reserved for grief. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, promising an evening storm. But for the first time in 3 years, Ben Carter wasn't worried about the weather. He was too busy preparing for a different kind of storm entirely, one that would test everything he thought he knew about justice, family, and the lengths a man would go to protect the innocent. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western Horizon when Ben returned from town, his truck loaded with supplies and his mind heavy with new information. Helen Rodriguez had been as discreet as promised, asking no questions as she rang up formula, diapers, baby clothes, and groceries. But as he'd loaded the bags into his truck, she'd followed him outside with a worried expression. "Ben," she'd said quietly, "there were some men in here about an hour ago. Said they were looking for a young woman with a baby. Had pictures and everything. I told them I hadn't seen anyone, but they didn't look like the type to give up easy." Now, as he pulled into his driveway, Ben's eyes automatically scanned the horizon for any sign of approaching vehicles. The ranch looked peaceful in the golden afternoon light, his cattle clustered near the stock tank, a red-tailed hawk circling high overhead. But peace could be deceptive in Texas. He'd learned that the hard way. Maria met him at the door, the shotgun held correctly but awkwardly in her hands. Relief flooded her face when she saw it was him, and she quickly set the weapon aside. "Any problems?" she asked as he carried the bags inside. "Not yet, but they're getting close." Ben set the groceries on the kitchen counter and began unpacking. "Helen says 3 men came by the store asking about you. Had photographs." Maria's face went pale. "That was fast. Your father strikes me as the type who doesn't waste time." Ben handed her several cans of infant formula. "How's Rosa?" "Hungry and fussy, but she took some of the sugar water. I was afraid to try heating it without knowing if your stove worked the same as ours." Ben almost smiled at that. It was such a normal concern, the kind of thing any young mother might worry about in an unfamiliar kitchen. The kind of worry that had nothing to do with murder and everything to do with wanting to care for a child properly. "Let me show you," he said, and for the next few minutes they worked together to prepare Rosa's bottle. The domesticity of it felt strange after 3 years of solitude, but not unwelcome. Ben found himself remembering how to guide someone through unfamiliar tasks, how to offer help without taking over completely. Rosa took to the formula immediately, her tiny hands grasping at the bottle as she drank with the desperate hunger of the very young. Maria watched her sister with an expression of such fierce love and protectiveness that it reminded Ben of lionesses he'd seen in nature documentaries, beautiful and deadly when their cubs were threatened. "Tell me about the rest of your family," Ben said as they settled in the living room. "Anyone else who might help, or anyone else who might side with your father?" Maria shifted Rosa to her shoulder and began patting her back gently. "My mother's family lives in Mexico, and they never approved of her marrying my father. They might help if they could, but they don't have the resources to stand up to him. On my father's side, there's only Uncle Victor and some cousins I barely know. What about friends? Anyone who might give you shelter?" "I had friends in high school, but that was 2 years ago. And my father made sure I didn't keep in touch with anyone he didn't approve of. He said friends were distractions from family responsibilities." Maria's voice carried the bitter tone of someone who'd learned too late that isolation was a tool of control. Ben nodded, recognizing the pattern. Abusers always tried to cut their victims off from potential support systems, making them dependent and vulnerable. It made his job harder now, but it also meant Carlos Santos would have a harder time predicting where Maria might run. "What about work? Did you have a job?" "I worked at my father's company, doing bookkeeping and filing. He said it was better to keep business in the family, that I could learn the trade from the ground up." Maria laughed bitterly. "Really? It was just another way to control me. I never got to develop skills that would let me be independent." Ben was beginning to build a picture of Carlos Santos that went beyond simple domestic violence. This was a man who controlled through systematic isolation and economic dependence, who used cultural and religious justifications for what was essentially psychological warfare against his own family. "Did he ever hit you before?" Maria's hand went unconsciously to her throat, tracing the fading bruises there. "Not like he hit my mother. With me, it was more Precise. A slap here, a grab there, always where it wouldn't show. He said it was discipline, that a father had the right to correct his daughter when she got out of line. And your mother? How long had he been hurting her? As long as I can remember, but it got worse after each miscarriage. He'd blame her for losing the babies, say she was too weak to carry sons. After the third one, he barely spoke to her, except to give orders or find fault. Maria's voice grew thick with unshed tears. I think part of her was relieved when Rosa was born, even though she was a girl. At least she'd finally carried a baby to term. Ben felt the familiar rage building in his chest, the same fury that had driven him to become a cop in the first place. The need to stand between predators and their prey, to use his size and strength and authority to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Maria, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. She looked up from Rosa, who had finished her bottle and was making the sleepy sounds of a well-fed infant. Are you sure your mother is dead? The question hit her like a physical blow, and for a moment, Ben thought she might collapse. Then her face hardened, and when she spoke, her voice carried absolute certainty. I checked. Before I ran, I checked. She wasn't breathing, and there was so much blood. Maria's voice broke. I wanted to call 911, but he was standing right there, and he said if I picked up that phone, Rosa would join her mother. So I ran, and I left her there, and I'll never forgive myself for that. Ben reached across the space between them and touched her hand gently. You did the only thing you could do. You saved Rosa. That's what your mother would have wanted. How do you know? Because mothers always choose their children's lives over their own. Always. Ben's voice carried the weight of personal knowledge, and Maria seemed to hear it. You lost someone too. It wasn't a question, and Ben didn't treat it like one. My wife and son. Car accident 3 years ago. I was working a case, didn't answer my phone when Sarah called. She was driving Tommy to soccer practice in the rain, and a drunk driver ran a red light. I'm sorry. So am I sorry I wasn't there. Sorry I was too focused on my job to pay attention to what mattered. Sorry I never got to tell them how much they meant to me. Ben looked toward the hallway, toward the locked door that held 3 years of unprocessed grief. That's why I'm going to help you, Maria, because I know what it's like to lose family to someone else's violence. And I know what it's like to wish you'd been stronger, faster, better when it mattered most. Outside, the sun had disappeared behind a bank of clouds that promised the storm Ben had been watching all day. The first drops of rain began to spatter against the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. They'll come tonight, Maria said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. Maybe. Or maybe tomorrow, but they'll come. Ben stood and walked to the window, checking the view of the road one more time. When they do, we'll be ready. But even as he said the words, Ben wondered if anyone could ever really be ready for the kind of violence that Carlos Santos represented. The kind of hate that could turn a father's hand against his own blood, that could twist love into possession and protection into murder. Rosa stirred in Maria's arms, opening dark eyes that seemed to look directly at Ben with the trusting gaze of the very young. In that moment, he made a silent promise to the child and to the memory of his own son. This time, he would be fast enough. This time, he would be strong enough. This time, no innocent blood would be spilled on his watch. Thunder rumbled overhead, and the storm began in earnest. The rain arrived with the darkness, drumming against the ranch house roof like fingers tapping out an anxious rhythm. Ben had drawn all the curtains and turned off the front porch light, transforming his home into a fortress of shadows and silence. Inside, the living room glowed with the soft light of a single lamp, creating an island of warmth in the growing storm. Maria sat curled in the corner of the couch, Rosa sleeping peacefully in her arms after another feeding. The baby's tiny chest rose and fell with the steady rhythm of the innocent, unaware that men with violent intentions might be searching for her through the Texas night. Maria, however, was hyper-alert, her eyes darting to every creak of the house, every shift in the wind outside. Ben moved through his home with the practiced stealth of someone who understood that survival sometimes depended on being noticed. He checked the locks on all the doors, tested the latches on the windows, and retrieved additional weapons from the gun safe in his bedroom. 2 pistols, another shotgun, and enough ammunition to hold off a small army. The weight of the firearms felt familiar in his hands, muscle memory from his law enforcement days, reasserting itself despite 3 years of deliberate forgetting. "Tell me about Uncle Victor," Ben said quietly as he returned to the living room, settling the extra weapons. "Within easy reach. What kind of man is he?" Maria shifted Rosa to her other arm, her movements automatic and protective. "Victor Morales is my father's younger brother, but he's always been the dangerous one. My father controls through intimidation and manipulation. But Victor enjoys the violence. He spent 5 years in Huntsville for aggravated assault, got out about 2 years ago." "What was the assault charge for?" "He beat a man nearly to death outside a bar in San Antonio. The victim had supposedly insulted the Santos family name, said something about my father's business practices. Victor put him in the hospital for 3 months. Maria's voice carried the matter-of-fact tone of someone who'd grown up around casual brutality. "My father always said Victor was protecting family honor, but I think Victor was just looking for an excuse to hurt someone." Ben absorbed this information, mentally cataloging the threat level. A man with a history of serious violence, recently released from prison, with family loyalty as motivation and nothing left to lose. It was the kind of enemy that kept experienced cops awake at night. How many other men might your father bring? Victor has friends from prison, and my father employs several men who owe him money or favors. If he's serious about finding us, he could have anywhere from 3 to 8 men. Maria looked down at Rosa, whose sleep seemed so peaceful it was almost otherworldly. "But he won't bring too many. My father likes to handle family business quietly, without attracting attention from law enforcement." "Speaking of law enforcement, have you considered going to the police?" Maria's laugh was bitter and empty. "With what evidence?" "My father is a respected businessman who gives generously to local political campaigns. I'm a 19-year-old girl with no witnesses and no body. Even if they believed me about my mother, what could they do? Issue a warrant based on my word alone?" Ben understood the reality she was describing. Domestic violence cases were notoriously difficult to prosecute, especially when the abuser had money and community standing. The system that was supposed to protect victims too often failed them, leaving them vulnerable to retaliation from the very people they'd tried to escape. "Besides," Maria continued, "going to the police would mean entering the system, and the system would want to take Rosa away from me. I'm not her legal guardian. I'm not even 18 yet in the eyes of some bureaucrats. They'd put her in foster care while they sorted everything out, and my father has enough connections to make problems disappear from the inside." Ben had to admit she was probably right. The child welfare system, despite good intentions, was often a maze of regulations and delays that could leave children vulnerable to exactly the kind of manipulation Carlos Santos specialized in. A man with money and patience could work that system to his advantage. "So we handle this ourselves," Ben said, the words carrying the weight of a final decision. "I know it's a lot to ask. I know you don't owe us anything." Ben looked at Rosa, sleeping so trustingly in her sister's arms, and felt something shift inside his chest. The part of him that had been frozen since Sarah and Tommy died was beginning to thaw, and with it came a clarity he hadn't experienced in years. 3 years ago, I failed to protect the people who mattered most to me. I was too busy being Sheriff Carter to be husband and father when they needed me. I won't make that mistake again. This isn't your responsibility. Yes, it is. Not. because of my badge or my training or any legal obligation. It's my responsibility because I'm choosing to make it my responsibility. Because someone has to stand between predators and their prey, and right now, that someone is me. The conviction in his own voice surprised Ben. For 3 years, he'd told himself that he was done being a protector, done putting himself between danger and innocence. He'd convinced himself that retirement from law enforcement meant retirement from caring about justice. But Maria and Rosa had awakened something in him that grief couldn't kill, a fundamental need to use his strength in service of the defenseless. Thunder crashed overhead, close enough to shake the windows, and both adults instinctively looked toward Rosa. The baby stirred but didn't wake, her small body radiating the kind of trust that only comes from never having been betrayed by the world. Ben wondered how long that innocence would last, whether they could preserve it long enough for her to grow up safe and loved. "There's something I need to show you," Ben said, standing and walking toward the hallway. He paused at the door he'd kept locked for 3 years, his hand resting on the knob. It might help with Rosa's care. The door opened with a soft click, releasing air that smelled of dust and abandoned dreams. Ben stepped aside to let Maria see into the room, watching her face as she took in what he'd preserved like a shrine to his own failure. It had been Tommy's nursery, decorated in soft blues and greens with a border of cartoon animals around the walls. The crib still held the mobile Sarah had chosen, tiny airplanes that would have turned slowly in the breeze from the ceiling fan. A changing table stood ready with supplies that had expired years ago, and a rocking chair sat by the window where Sarah had planned to feed their son and watch the sunrise over the ranch. "Oh, Ben," Maria whispered, understanding immediately what she was seeing. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." Ben stepped into the room and began opening drawers, revealing carefully preserved baby clothes, blankets, toys that would never be played with. Tommy was stillborn, cord wrapped around his neck during delivery. Sarah held him for 3 hours, and then we brought him home to bury him under the oak tree by the creek. Maria followed him into the room, Rosa cradled against her chest. "I'm so sorry. We were going to try again." Sarah wanted a house full of children, said she had enough love in her heart for a dozen babies. But then the accident happened, and suddenly this room was just a monument to everything I'd lost. Ben pulled out a package of newborn diapers, still sealed in plastic. Maybe it's time it served its original purpose again. Working together, they cleared away the expired supplies and dust, transforming the abandoned nursery into a functional space for Rosa's care. Maria moved through the tasks with practiced efficiency, while Ben found himself remembering Sarah's excitement as she'd prepared this same room 7 years ago. The memories hurt, but they also carried a warmth he'd forgotten existed. "She would have loved this," Maria said as she arranged Rosa's few belongings on the changing table. "Your wife, I mean. She would have loved seeing her nursery used to protect a baby. How do you know? Because she married you. And you're the kind of man who opens his home to strangers, who risks his life to protect children he's never met. She had to be the kind of woman who would understand that impulse." Maria settled Rosa in the crib, and the baby stretched her tiny arms without waking. What was her name? Sarah Elizabeth Carter. She taught 3rd grade at the elementary school in Cedar Valley, had a laugh that could fill up a room, and she never met a stray dog she wouldn't feed. Ben found himself smiling at the memories. Tommy would have been 4 years old next month. Sarah always said he was going to grow up to be either a veterinarian or a professional baseball player, depending on whether he inherited her heart or my competitive streak. "Tell me more about them." And so Ben did, standing in the nursery that had waited 3 years for the sound of a baby's breathing. He told Maria about Sarah's terrible cooking and her beautiful singing voice, about her habit of leaving inspirational notes in his lunch bag, and her complete inability to remember where she'd left her car keys. He talked about Tommy's kicks. In the womb, how Sarah would place Ben's hand on her belly, and they'd feel their son moving, already restless to see the world that was waiting for him. It was the first time Ben had spoken their names aloud in over a year, and he was surprised to find that the words didn't cut as deeply as he'd expected. The pain was still there, would always be there, but it was balanced now by something else. Purpose, maybe, or hope. "They sound wonderful," Maria said when he finished. "Rosa's lucky to have their room." "No, I'm lucky to have Rosa using their room. Sarah always said this house was meant to be filled with children's laughter." Maybe she was just early about the timing. They were interrupted by a sound that made both adults freeze. Car engines, more than one, coming up the long drive toward the ranch house. Ben moved to the window and carefully lifted one corner of the curtain, peering out into the storm-darkened night. 3 vehicles were approaching with their headlights off, moving slowly to avoid making noise. 2 pickup trucks and what looked like an SUV, all dark-colored and impossible to identify in the rain. They stopped about 50 yards from the house, just outside the circle of light from Ben's security fixtures. "They're here," he said quietly, his voice carrying the calm certainty of a man who'd been expecting this moment. Maria scooped Rosa from the crib, her movements quick but gentle. The baby woke and made a small sound of protest, but Maria shushed her with the expertise of someone who'd been caring for an infant while fleeing for her life. "What do we do?" Ben was already moving, grabbing the rifle from where he'd leaned it against the wall. His training kicked in automatically, years of tactical experience overriding the civilian he'd tried to become. "Check weapons, secure the perimeter, identify escape routes, protect the innocents. You and Rosa go to the back bedroom, the one with the window that faces the creek. If things go bad, you climb out and head for the tree line. Follow the creek downstream until you reach the Rodriguez place about 3 miles south. Helen will call for help. What about you? I'm going to see if we can resolve this without anyone getting hurt." Ben checked the load on his rifle, his movements automatic and professional. "But Maria, if shooting starts, you don't wait around to see how it ends. You take Rosa and you run, and you don't stop until you're both safe. I won't leave you to face them alone." "Yes, you will. Because that baby is more important than any of our lives, including mine. Promise me." Maria looked at him for a long moment, seeing something in his face that made her nod reluctantly. "I promise." "Good, now go." Ben watched her disappear down the hallway with Rosa, then turned his attention to the men outside. Through the window, he could see figures moving between the vehicles, at least 5 men spreading out to surround the house. They moved with the kind of coordination that suggested military or law enforcement training, which meant Carlos Santos had recruited more than just local thugs. The phone rang, startling him with its sudden intrusion into the tense silence. Ben considered not answering, then realized that whoever was calling might provide information he could use. "Carter, Ben Carter?" The voice was heavily accented, carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "My name is Carlos Santos. I believe you have something that belongs to me. I don't have anything that belongs to you, Santos. You have my daughter and my granddaughter. I want them back. Your daughter is dead, according to Maria. And Rosa isn't your granddaughter, she's your daughter. The daughter you tried to kill because she wasn't born male." There was a pause, and when Carlos spoke again, his voice carried an edge of barely controlled rage. "You don't understand our family traditions, Mr. Carter. You don't understand what honor means to people like us. I understand that you murdered your wife because she gave birth to a girl. I understand that you're hunting a 3-week-old baby because she threatens your twisted sense of masculinity. And I understand that you're trespassing on my property with armed men, which gives me the legal right to defend myself." "Legal rights?" Carlos laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You think this is about legal rights? This is about blood, Mr. Carter. about family obligations that go deeper than your American laws. Then let me explain something about American laws, Santos. In Texas, a man's home is his castle, and he has the right to defend it against anyone who threatens the people under his protection. That includes confused old men who think murder is a family tradition. The line went quiet for several seconds, and Ben used the time to check the positions of the men outside. They'd finished surrounding the house and were holding position, waiting for orders. Professional deployment, which confirmed his suspicion that Carlos had hired experienced help. "I'm going to give you one chance, Mr. Carter. Send my daughter and the baby outside, and we'll leave you in peace. Refuse, and we'll come in and take them. Your choice." "Here's my choice, Santos. You and your men get back in your vehicles and drive away, right now. Because if you take one step toward this house, I'm going to defend it with everything I have. You're 1 man against 5, Mr. Carter. Those are not good odds. Maybe not. But I'm 1 man with nothing left to lose, fighting to protect children on my own property. You're 5 men trying to murder a baby because she wasn't born with the right anatomy. Which one of us do you think God is going to favor in this fight?" Ben hung up the phone and moved away from the window, knowing that the conversation was over and the violence was about to begin. He'd dealt with men like Carlos Santos before, bullies who used intimidation and violence to control others, who mistook cruelty for strength and brutality for honor. They understood only one language, and Ben was prepared to speak it fluently. The first shot came through the living room window, shattering glass and sending fragments across the floor where Maria and Rosa had been sitting just minutes before. Ben was already moving, dropping to one knee behind the couch and returning fire through the broken window. His shot was deliberate and precise, aimed not to kill but to send a clear message about his capabilities. The muzzle flash of his rifle lit up the interior of the house for a split second, and Ben saw movement in the hallway. Maria appeared in the doorway of the back bedroom, Rosa in her arms, her face pale with terror. "Stay down and stay back," Ben called to her. "They're testing our defenses." More shots came from different directions, confirming that the house was completely surrounded. Ben moved from window to window, returning fire when he had clear targets, forcing the attackers to take cover and think twice about rushing the building. His years of training served him well, muscle memory guiding his movements as he calculated angles and distances, ammunition and time. The phone rang again, and Ben ignored it. There was nothing left to negotiate, no middle ground between Carlos Santos' definition of family honor and Ben's commitment to protecting innocent life. This would end only when one side gave up or couldn't continue fighting. A new sound reached his ears over the gunfire and thunder, the distinctive whine of an engine being pushed to its limits. Vehicle headlights swept across the ranch as someone drove up the private road at dangerous speed, and Ben wondered if Carlos had called for reinforcements. But the vehicle that skidded to a stop behind the attacker's position wasn't another group of thugs. It was Deputy Jake Morrison's patrol car, emergency lights flashing red and blue through the rain. Jake's voice boomed across the ranch yard through his car's PA system. "This is the Cedar Valley Sheriff's Department. Drop your weapons and step away from the house, now." The gunfire stopped abruptly, replaced by shouted Spanish and the sound of men scrambling for new positions. Ben used the distraction to reload, his rifle in check on Maria, who was still crouched in the back bedroom doorway with Rosa pressed against her chest. "The cavalry has arrived," he told her. "But stay put until we know how this plays out." Through the broken window, Ben could see Carlos Santos standing beside his SUV, apparently trying to decide whether to continue the assault or retreat. The arrival of law enforcement had changed the tactical situation, but Ben wasn't sure it had changed Carlos' determination to reclaim Rosa. Jake Morrison stepped out of his patrol car with his service weapon drawn, taking cover behind the engine. "Block! Mr. Santos, you and your men need to drop your weapons immediately." This is private property, and you're in violation of multiple state and federal laws. This is a family matter, Deputy, Carlos called back. That man is harboring my kidnapped daughter and granddaughter. Then we'll sort it out through proper legal channels. But right now, you're engaged in an armed assault on a private residence, and that stops immediately. Ben could hear the authority in Jake's voice, the confident tone of a lawman who knew he held the moral and legal high ground. But he also heard the slight tremor that suggested Jake was outnumbered and scared, hoping his badge would be enough to prevent further violence. Carlos Santos apparently heard the same tremor, because his response carried the arrogance of a man who believed money and connections made him untouchable. Deputy Morrison, isn't it? I know you're Sheriff Frank Reeves. Good man, reasonable man. I think when he hears the full story about this situation, he'll understand that I'm simply trying to recover stolen family members. Maybe so, Mr. Santos, but that's not how we handle things in Cedar Valley. You want to make accusations, you come to the station during business hours and file a proper complaint. You don't show up at a man's ranch with armed men and start shooting up his house, then smiled grimly at Jake's response. The young deputy was holding his ground despite being seriously outgunned, using procedure and law as weapons against Carlos' intimidation tactics. It was exactly the kind of courage Ben had tried to instill in the younger officers during his years as sheriff. The standoff continued for several more minutes, with Carlos and Jake exchanging increasingly heated words while the armed men maintained their positions around the ranch house. Ben used the time to reload his weapons and consider his options, knowing that Jake's arrival had changed the dynamics but not necessarily the outcome. Then Rosa began to cry. The sound of the baby's distress cut through the night like a blade. High and plaintive and utterly innocent. It was the sound of a child who was hungry and frightened and couldn't understand why the adults around her were making so much noise and chaos. It was also the sound that broke whatever restraint Carlos Santos had been showing. "That's my granddaughter," he shouted, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and something that might have been grief. "That's Elena's blood crying in there. And I won't let her be raised by strangers." Ben saw Carlos start moving toward the house, his face twisted with an obsession that had moved beyond reason into pure madness. The other men followed their leader, abandoning cover and advancing despite Jake's shouted warnings. The final battle for Rosa's life was about to begin, and Ben Carter prepared to face it with the same determination that had once made him the best sheriff Cedar Valley had ever known. The difference was, this time he wasn't fighting for justice or law or community safety. This time he was fighting for family. And that made all the difference in the world. The first man through Ben's front door never had a chance to fire his weapon. Ben's shotgun blast caught him center mass, sending him sprawling backward into the night with a cry that mixed pain and surprise in equal measure. The sound echoed across the ranch like thunder, momentarily drowning out Rosa's wails and the shouts of the remaining attackers. "One down," Ben muttered, pumping another shell into the chamber as he moved away from the doorway. The tactical part of his mind was already calculating odds and angles, ammunition remaining versus targets still active. 4 men left, plus Carlos Santos himself. Deputy Morrison somewhere outside trying to maintain order in a situation that had moved far beyond normal law enforcement protocols. Maria appeared at the end of the hallway. Rosa clutched against her chest, her eyes wide with terror. "Is he wounded, not dead? But he won't be getting up anytime soon." Ben kept his attention focused on the shattered doorway, waiting for the next assault. "I told you to stay in the back room. Rosa won't stop crying. I think she can. Sense the danger." Maria's voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd been running on pure adrenaline for too long. "What do we do now?" Before Ben could answer, Jake Morrison's voice cut through the chaos from outside. "Mr. Santos, one of your men has been shot. He needs medical attention immediately. This has to stop now." Carlos Santa's response came, loaded with venom and desperation. My granddaughter is in that house crying for her family. Every second she spends with those strangers is another moment of trauma that could scar her for life. Sir, that's not how child psychology works. And this isn't how we resolve custody disputes in Texas. Jake's voice carried the strain of a young officer trying to maintain authority in an impossible situation. I'm calling for backup and an ambulance. When they arrive, we're going to sort this out properly. There won't be time for backup. Deputy, my daughter has been brainwashed by whoever's in that house. She doesn't understand what's best for her or the baby. Ben moved to a side window, carefully lifting the edge of a curtain to assess the tactical situation. The wounded man was crawling away from the porch, leaving a dark trail in the mud. Carlos stood behind his SUV, gesturing wildly as he spoke to Jake, his face twisted with the kind of rage that came from a lifetime of getting his way through intimidation and violence. The other 3 men had taken cover behind various pieces of ranch equipment, but Ben could see them repositioning for another assault. One carried what looked like a hunting rifle, another had a pistol, and the third was armed with a shotgun similar to Ben's own. They moved with military precision, suggesting Carlos had indeed recruited experienced help for this mission. Maria, I need you to listen to me very carefully, Ben said, without turning away from the window. In about 30 seconds, they're going to try rushing the house from multiple directions. When that happens, you take Rosa and you go out the back window, like we discussed. I'm not leaving you. Yes, you are. Because if they get into this house, they'll kill me and take Rosa. Your only chance to save her is to run while I keep them busy. Ben's voice carried the absolute authority of a man who'd made command decisions in life or death situations. Promise me. Maria was quiet for a long moment, and Ben could hear Rosa's cries growing weaker as exhaustion began to overtake fear. Finally, Maria spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I promise. But Ben, if you don't make it out of this, I want you to know that Rosa and I will remember what you did for us. We'll make sure the world knows there was a good man named Ben Carter who died protecting children he barely knew. I don't plan on dying tonight, Maria. I plan on watching Rosa grow up safe and happy, maybe teaching her to ride horses and drive cattle like any other ranch kid. Ben checked his ammunition one more time, then moved toward the kitchen where he had a better angle on the approaching attackers. But if things go wrong, you make sure she knows her mother loved her enough to die protecting her, and her sister loved her enough to risk everything to keep her safe. The assault came exactly when Ben expected it, with the coordinated precision of a military operation. 2 men approached from the front while the third circled around to the back of the house, trying to catch Ben in a crossfire. But Ben had been anticipating this exact scenario, and his years of law enforcement experience had taught him how to turn a defender's disadvantage into strategic opportunity. The kitchen window exploded inward as the man with the hunting rifle tried to provide covering fire for his companions. Ben was already moving, using the kitchen island as cover while he returned fire through the window. His shot was hurried but effective, catching the rifleman in the shoulder and spinning him away from the house with a howl of pain and rage. 2 down, 2 to go, plus Carlos Santos himself. The sound of breaking glass from the back of the house told Ben that the third attacker had found his way to the bedroom window. Maria's scream confirmed it, high and terrified, and cut short in a way that made Ben's blood run cold. Rosa's crying intensified, the sound of a baby whose world had suddenly become even more dangerous and chaotic. Ben abandoned his position in the kitchen and sprinted toward the back of the house, knowing he was exposing himself to attack from the front, but unable to ignore Maria's danger. He burst into the bedroom to find Maria pressed against the wall, Rosa in her arms, while a large man in dark clothing climbed through the broken window with a pistol in his hand. "Drop the gun and step away from the girl," the man commanded, his voice carrying a slight accent that marked him as one of Carlos' recruits. Nobody else has to get hurt if you cooperate. Ben's response was immediate and final. The shotgun. Blast at close range lifted the intruder off his feet and slammed him back through the window he'd just entered, taking most of the glass and window frame with him. The sound was deafening in the confined space, and Rosa's cries reached a pitch that seemed to pierce straight through Ben's skull. "Are you hurt?" Ben asked Maria, who was staring at the destroyed window with shell-shocked eyes. "No, but Rosa won't stop crying. I think the noise is terrifying her." Maria rocked the baby desperately, trying to provide comfort in a situation where comfort seemed impossible. "How many more are there?" "2 plus Carlos. But they know I'm serious now." Ben reloaded the shotgun with practiced efficiency, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "They'll be more careful, which gives us more time." Jake Morrison's voice carried across the ranch yard, higher pitched now with stress and the recognition that the situation had spiraled completely beyond his control. "Mr. Santos, 3 of your men are down. This ends now, or I start making arrests. For attempted murder. You arrest me, deputy, and I'll have your job by morning. I know people in Austin, people in Washington. You're nothing but a small-town cop who doesn't understand the complexities of family law." Carlos' voice had taken on the desperate edge of a man watching his carefully laid plans crumble around him. "That baby belongs with her blood family, not with strangers who've filled my daughter's head with lies. Sir, I don't care who you know or where you know them. Right now you're engaged in an armed assault on a private residence, and 3 people have been shot. That makes this a major felony, and my job is to stop it before anyone else gets hurt." Ben could hear the sound of sirens in the distance, still far away but growing closer. Backup was coming, but the question was whether it would arrive in time to prevent further bloodshed. Carlos Santos was clearly a man accustomed to getting his way through violence and intimidation, and the failure of his assault was likely pushing him toward increasingly desperate measures. "Maria, can you hear those sirens?" She nodded, still rocking Rosa, whose cries had finally begun to subside into exhausted whimpers. "That's our cavalry. 5 more minutes, maybe 10, and this place will be crawling with sheriff's deputies and state troopers. Carlos Santos can threaten one small-town deputy, but he can't intimidate an entire task force. What if he doesn't wait for them to arrive? What if he decides to end this before backup gets here?" Ben had been wondering the same thing. Carlos Santos was clearly not a man who accepted defeat gracefully, and the approaching sirens would be forcing him to make a decision. Retreat and lose Rosa forever, or escalate to the point where retreat became impossible. The answer came in the form of breaking glass from the living room, followed by the distinctive whoosh of accelerant igniting. Carlos Santos had apparently decided that if he couldn't have Rosa, then nobody could. He was trying to burn down the ranch house with all of them inside. Smoke began seeping under the bedroom door almost immediately, acrid and thick with the chemical smell of gasoline. Ben could hear flames crackling in the front of the house, spreading with the unnatural speed that only came from deliberate arson. The temperature in the bedroom began to rise, and Rosa started crying again as the smoke irritated her sensitive lungs. "We have to go, now." Ben grabbed Maria's arm and guided her toward the broken window, kicking away the remaining glass to create a safe exit. "Can you climb out with Rosa?" "I think so. But what about you? I'm right behind you." "But Maria, once you're outside, you head straight for the creek and you don't look back. If Carlos or his remaining men try to stop you, you keep running. Rosa's life is more important than anything else." Maria nodded and carefully climbed through the window, cradling Rosa against her chest to protect the baby from the broken glass and rough wooden frame. Ben watched her drop to the ground outside, stumble slightly, then regain her footing and start toward the tree line. The smoke was getting thicker now, and Ben could hear the flames spreading through the front of the house with hungry efficiency. Whatever accelerant Carlos had used, he'd used plenty of it. The ranch house that had been Ben's sanctuary for 3 years was being transformed into a death trap. Ben followed Maria through the window, dropping to the muddy ground just as the bedroom ceiling began to glow with reflected firelight. The rain that had been falling steadily all evening was doing nothing to slow the chemically enhanced flames, and Ben realized that Carlos Santos had just committed himself to a course of action that would end in either complete victory or total destruction. Jake Morrison's voice cut through the night, now openly panicked. "Fire department's been notified, but it'll be 20 minutes before they can get here. Mr. Santos, you've just committed arson on top of everything else. This is your last chance to surrender peacefully." Carlos Santos' response came not in words but in actions. Ben heard the distinctive crack of a high-powered rifle, followed by Jake's cry of pain and the metallic crash of the deputy taking cover behind his patrol car. Carlos had apparently decided that law enforcement was no longer an obstacle to be negotiated with, but a target to be eliminated. Ben could see Maria moving through the darkness toward the creek, Rosa's white blanket visible in the intermittent moonlight filtering through the storm clouds. She was maybe 50 yards from safety when Ben spotted the fourth attacker, the one with the pistol, moving to intercept her path to the tree line. The man was limping, probably wounded in the earlier firefight, but he was still mobile and still armed. Ben could see him raising his weapon, taking aim at Maria's retreating figure, preparing to end Rosa's life with a single shot. Ben's rifle was steady in his hands despite the heat and smoke and chaos surrounding him. The distance was maybe 60 yards, a difficult shot under perfect conditions, nearly impossible in the rain and darkness and stress of combat. But Ben had been making difficult shots since before Maria Santos was born, and muscle memory guided his aim as surely as conscious thought. The shot took the gunman in the center of his chest, spinning him around and dropping him face first into the mud. He didn't get up again, and Ben felt a grim satisfaction at eliminating the threat to Maria and Rosa. 4 down, 1 to go. But Carlos Santos was proving to be the most dangerous enemy of all, because he was fighting not for money or loyalty or even survival, but for a twisted vision of family honor that made compromise impossible. He was the kind of enemy Ben had learned to fear most during his law enforcement career, the true believers who would rather die than admit they were wrong. The ranch house was fully engulfed now, flames shooting through the roof and casting hellish shadows across the yard. Ben's home, his sanctuary, his final connection to Sarah and Tommy, was being consumed by fire set by a madman who believed murder was justified by tradition. The loss cut through Ben like a physical wound, but it also crystallized his determination to ensure that Rosa survived to grow up in a world where such madness couldn't touch her. Jake Morrison was still alive. Ben could see him moving behind his patrol car, but the deputy was clearly wounded and in no condition to continue the fight. The sirens were getting closer, but they were still minutes away, and Carlos Santos was using those minutes to position himself for one final assault. Ben spotted him moving through the smoke and firelight, using the burning house as cover while he circled toward the creek where Maria was fleeing with Rosa. Carlos had abandoned his rifle in favor of a pistol, probably planning to get close enough to ensure that his shots would be fatal. He moved with the desperate purpose of a man who knew this was his last chance to achieve his twisted goals. The final confrontation would happen at the creek, Ben realized. Carlos would catch up to Maria just as she reached what should have been safety, and Ben would have to choose between his own survival and his commitment to protect Rosa. It wasn't really a choice at all. Ben Carter had failed once to save the people he loved most. He would not fail again. He began moving through the darkness toward the creek, leaving behind the burning ruins of his old life and carrying with him the weapons and determination necessary to forge a new one. The rain continued to fall, hissing against the flames and turning the ranch yard into a battlefield of mud and smoke and desperate hope. Behind him, the sirens grew louder. Ahead of him, a 19-year-old girl carried her baby sister toward safety through the Texas night, trusting that the man she'd met only hours before would keep his promise to protect them. And somewhere in the darkness between safety and destruction, Carlos Santos prepared to make his final stand for a version of family honor that required the death of innocents. The storm was reaching its climax, and so was the battle for Rosa's life. Ben Carter moved through the night like a ghost seeking redemption, carrying 3 years of grief and guilt toward what he knew would be either salvation or damnation. The only certainty was that by morning, everything would be different. The creek ran high with storm water, its normally gentle current transformed into something swift and dangerous by the evening's rainfall. Maria stumbled along its bank, Rosa pressed tight against her chest, both of them soaked through and shivering despite the warm Texas night. The baby had stopped crying, but her breathing was quick and shallow in a way that suggested exhaustion rather than peace. Behind them, Ben's ranch house burned like a beacon against the darkness, the flames visible for miles across the hill. Country, the sound of the fire mixed with thunder and sirens and the distant shouts of men, creating a symphony of chaos that seemed to press down on Maria like a physical weight. She could hear someone moving through the brush behind her, footsteps that were too heavy and deliberate to belong to Ben Carter. Carlos Santos had found her trail, and he was closing the distance with the relentless determination of a predator who had cornered his prey. Maria pressed herself against a large oak tree at the creek's edge, trying to become invisible in the shadows while she caught her breath and planned her next move. Rosa stirred in her arms, making the small sounds that preceded a crying fit, and Maria rocked her gently while whispering desperate prayers to saints whose names she'd learned at her mother's knee. Santa Elena, protégée to Nita. Santa Rosa, cuida la Bibi que leva tu nombre. The footsteps were getting closer, and Maria could see the beam of a flashlight sweeping back and forth through the trees. Her father had always been a patient hunter, whether he was tracking deer through the South Texas brush or pursuing family members who had dared to defy his authority. He would find her eventually, and when he did, this nightmare would end the only way he'd ever intended it to end. But then another sound reached her ears, boots moving through the mud with the careful precision of someone who knew how to hunt. Hunters. Ben Carter was out there in the darkness, stalking her father with the same determination that Carlos was showing in pursuing her. The thought gave Maria a spark of hope, even as her rational mind told her that one man, no matter how skilled or motivated, couldn't stand against the kind of focused hatred that had driven her father to arson and attempted murder. The flashlight beam swept past her hiding place, then returned, probing the shadows around the oak tree with methodical thoroughness. Maria held her breath and pressed Rosa's face against her chest, trying to muffle any sound the baby might make. For a moment, the light seemed to pass by, and Maria began to hope she'd remained undetected. Then Carlos Santos stepped out of the brush 15 feet away, his pistol trained directly on her heart. "Hello, Mia. It's time to come home." Maria looked at her father and saw a stranger. The man who had raised her, who had taught her to read and driven her to school and walked her to church every Sunday, had been replaced by something hollow and desperate. His clothes were torn and muddy, his face was streaked with soot from the fire, and his eyes carried the wild light of someone who had moved beyond reason into pure obsession. "Papa, please. Rosa hasn't done anything wrong. She's just a baby. She's an abomination, a curse on our family name. Your mother died because God was punishing us for the sins we allowed into our house." Carlos took a step closer, and Maria could see his finger tightening on the trigger. "But I can fix this. I can make things right again. Mama died because you killed her. Rosa didn't curse our family, you did." The words seemed to hit Carlos like physical blows, and for a moment his certainty wavered. Maria saw something. Human flicker behind his eyes, a flash of the father she remembered from childhood. Then it was gone, replaced by the fanatic who had burned down a man's home to get what he wanted. Your mother died because she failed in her duty as a wife. She was supposed to give me sons, strong boys who could carry on the Santos name. Instead, she gave me daughters, weak things that bring shame and require protection. Carlos raised the pistol until it pointed directly at Rosa's tiny form. This ends tonight, Maria. One way or another, this curse ends tonight. The only curse here is you. Ben Carter's voice cut through the darkness like a blade, calm and certain and absolutely final. He emerged from the trees behind Carlos, his rifle trained on the older man's back, his face carrying the expression of someone who had already made his peace with whatever was about to happen. Carlos spun around, trying to bring his pistol to bear on this new threat, but Ben was already moving. The rifle shot echoed across the creek like thunder, and Carlos Santos crumpled to the muddy ground, his weapon spinning away into the darkness. Maria waited for her father to get up, to continue his pursuit, to prove that hatred was stronger than bullets. But Carlos Santos lay still in the mud, his eyes staring up at the storm clouds with the empty gaze of the dead. Is he? Maria couldn't finish the question. Ben knelt beside Carlos' body, checking for signs of life with the professional thoroughness of someone who'd done this before. After a moment, he looked up at Maria and nodded. It's over. Rosa's safe. And then, as if she'd been waiting for those exact words, Rosa began to cry. Not the terrified wails of the evening's chaos, but the normal, healthy crying of a baby who was hungry and wet and tired of being carried through the Texas night by people who smelled like smoke and fear. Maria began to laugh, a sound that bordered on hysteria but carried notes of relief and joy and desperate gratitude. Rosa was alive. Rosa was safe. The nightmare that had begun 4 days ago with their mother's murder was finally truly over. Ben guided them away from Carlos' body, back toward the burning ranch where the sirens had finally arrived in force. Sheriff's deputies and state troopers were establishing a perimeter around the fire, and an ambulance was treating Jake Morrison's wounds, while paramedics prepared for additional casualties. As they walked through the chaos, Maria realized that she had no idea what came next. Her father was dead. Her mother was dead. She was 19 years old with no family except a 3-week-old baby. No money except the $20 left in her pocket, and no home except the charity of a man she'd met 12 hours ago. What happens now? She asked Ben as they approached. The emergency vehicles. Ben looked down at Rosa, who had finally stopped crying and was looking around with the wide-eyed curiosity of the very young. Then he looked at Maria, seeing not the desperate fugitive who had appeared at his door, but the brave young woman who had risked everything to protect her sister. Now we go home, he said simply. I've got a guest room that needs occupying, a nursery that needs a baby, and enough space on this ranch for a family of any size. But your house. Ben looked back at the burning ruins of his old life, watching 3 years of grief and isolation disappear into smoke and ash. Houses can be rebuilt. Families are harder to replace. Maria felt fresh tears on her cheeks, but these were different from the tears of fear and desperation she'd been crying for days. These were tears of hope, of relief, of the possibility that Rosa might grow up safe and loved after all. Are you sure? You barely know us. I know enough. I know you're brave enough to stand up to a killer to protect a baby. I know you're smart enough to find help when you need it. And I know Rosa deserves to grow up somewhere she'd be wanted and cherished for exactly who she is. Ben's voice carried the certainty of a man who had found his purpose again. Besides, this ranch has been too quiet for too long. It could use the sound of children laughing. The ambulance crew approached them, medical bags in hand, ready to check Maria and Rosa for injuries. But as the paramedics began their examination, Maria kept her eyes on Ben Carter's face, seeing in it the promise of something she'd almost given up hoping for. A future where Rosa could grow up without fear, where being born female wasn't a curse to be eliminated, but a gift to be celebrated. A future where family meant love and protection rather than control and violence. It wasn't the future Maria had planned when she'd fled her father's house with nothing but a baby and $20. But as she watched Ben Carter organize the chaos around them with the calm competence of a man accustomed to solving problems and protecting people, she began to think it might be an even better future than anything she could have imagined. The storm was finally beginning to break, and through the dissipating clouds, Maria could see the first hint of dawn on the eastern horizon. Rosa's first day in her new home was about to begin. 6 months later, the new ranch house stood where the old one had burned, but it was different in ways that went far beyond architecture. Where Ben's original home had been a monument to solitude and grief, this one was designed for family. Wider hallways to accommodate a growing child, a kitchen with 2 high chairs instead of one lay stool, and windows positioned to let in maximum light rather than provide tactical advantages. Maria stood at the sink washing breakfast dishes, while Rosa played in her high chair, babbling happily at the dust motes dancing in the morning sunlight. The baby had grown substantially in the months since that terrible night, her cheeks full and rosy, her dark eyes bright with intelligence and mischief. She'd learned to sit up on her own, to grab for everything within reach, and to smile in a way that could melt the hardest heart. Ben came through the kitchen door carrying a bag of feed for the horses, his work boots leaving muddy prints on the tile floor that Maria had learned not to worry about. Ranch life meant accepting a certain amount of dirt as part of the natural order, and she'd discovered she preferred honest mud to the sterile perfection her father had demanded in his house. "Morning, ladies," Ben said, pausing to kiss the top of Rosa's head and ruffle Maria's hair in the casual way that had become routine between them. "How's our girl today?" "Hungry as usual, and she's figured out how to throw her cereal farther than I thought was physically possible." Maria gestured toward the scattered Cheerios decorating the floor around Rosa's chair. "I think she's practicing to be a pitcher. With her arm strength, she could probably make the major leagues." Ben poured himself coffee from the pot Maria had started before dawn, a habit she'd developed from watching her mother care for her father. The difference was that Ben always thanked her, always offered to make it himself, always treated her coffee as a gift rather than an obligation. The transformation in their daily routine had happened gradually, so naturally that Maria sometimes forgot there had ever been a time when she didn't wake up in the guest bedroom that had become permanently hers, when she didn't spend her mornings feeding Rosa in the kitchen while Ben planned the day's ranch work. They'd settled into domesticity like puzzle pieces finding their proper places, creating a family structure that felt both chosen and inevitable. "Helen Rodriguez called this morning," Ben said, settling into his chair at the kitchen table. "The adoption paperwork is ready for final signatures." Maria felt her heart skip a beat, the same nervous excitement she'd been experiencing every time the adoption came up in conversation. For 6 months, they'd been working with lawyers and social workers and family court judges to make Maria Rosa's legal guardian, a process complicated by the circumstances of Ilana Santos' death and Carlos Santos' criminal actions. "Any problems?" "None." Judge Williams reviewed all the documentation, including the statements from the investigators who worked your mother's case. "He's satisfied that you're Rosa's best option for a permanent guardian." Ben's voice carried the satisfaction of someone who'd spent considerable time and money ensuring the legal process went smoothly. "We just need to appear in court next Thursday to make it official. And after that? After that, Rosa Santos becomes Rosa Santos Carter, if you want her to take my name as well. She'd be legally your daughter, with all the rights and protections that come with it." Ben reached across the table and took Maria's hand, a gesture that had become natural between them. "And you'll be legally responsible for raising her however you think best." Maria looked at Rosa, who was systematically destroying a piece of toast by squeezing it between her tiny fingers. 6 months ago, Maria had been a terrified teenager fleeing for her life with a newborn baby and $20. Now she was about to become a legal adult with full parental rights and responsibilities, living on a ranch with a man who'd become the closest thing to a father she'd ever really had. The irony wasn't lost on her that Carlos Santos' attempt to destroy Rosa had instead led to the baby having more love and security than she ever would have experienced in his house. Rosa would grow up knowing that being female was a blessing rather than a curse. That strength came from protecting others rather than controlling them, and that family was defined by love rather than biology. Ben, can I ask you something I've been wondering about? Of course. Do you ever regret it? Taking us in, I mean. Your life was peaceful before we showed up. Now you've got a baby crying at all hours, formula stains on your furniture, and toys scattered all over the house. Ben was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. Then he smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face in a way that made him look younger and happier than Maria had ever seen him. Maria, before you knocked on my door, I was a dead man walking. I was going through the motions of living, without actually being alive. This house was a mausoleum, this ranch was a prison, and I was the ghost haunting both of them. He gestured toward Rosa, who had abandoned her toast in favor of playing peekaboo with her own hands. You two didn't disrupt my peace. You gave me back my life. But you lost so much. Your house, your privacy, your independence. Houses can be rebuilt better than they were before. Privacy is overrated when you're using it to hide from the world, and independence isn't worth much if you're not using it to help people who need you. Ben stood and walked to Rosa's high chair, lifting the baby out and settling her on his hip with practiced ease. Besides, look at what I gained. Rosa immediately grabbed for Ben's nose, a game that never failed to make her giggle with delight. Ben made exaggerated faces and sounds that sent the baby into peals of laughter, the kind of uninhibited joy that only children could produce. Maria watched them together and felt her heart swell with an emotion she was still learning to name. It wasn't romantic love, though she cared for Ben deeply and respected him more than any man she'd ever known. It wasn't familial love, though he'd become more of a father to her than Carlos Santos had ever been. It was something deeper and more complex, a bond forged through shared trauma and sustained through daily acts of kindness and protection. There's something else we need to discuss, Ben said, settling Rosa back in her high chair and returning to his coffee. Your future beyond just being Rosa's guardian. Maria felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. They'd touched on this topic several times over the months, but she'd always managed to redirect the conversation. The truth was, she had no idea what she wanted to do with her life beyond caring for Rosa. Her education had been interrupted by her father's control and then completely derailed by their flight to Ben's ranch. I've been thinking about that. And, I don't know. I never had the chance to figure out what I wanted to be when I grew up. My father had my whole life planned out for me. Marriage to some man he approved of. Children to carry on the Santos name, a life of serving his vision of what a woman should be. Maria stirred sugar into her coffee, a nervous habit she'd developed. Now I have choices, and I'm not sure how to make them. Well, you don't have to decide everything at once. But I do think you should consider finishing your education. You're smart, Maria. Smarter than you give yourself credit for. You could go to college, study whatever interests you, build a career that gives you independence and satisfaction. What about Rosa? I can't just leave her while I go to school. You won't have to. There's a community college in San Marcos, about an hour's drive from here. You could take classes during the day while Rosa naps, or evening classes after she goes to bed. I'd be happy to watch her whenever you need to study or attend class. The offer was generous beyond anything Maria had expected, but it also raised questions about their long-term arrangement. She'd been living in Ben's house for 6 months as a refugee, then as a friend, then as something approaching family. But what would happen when she became an independent adult with her own goals and ambitions? Ben, what are we doing here? I mean, what is this arrangement between us? What do you want it to be? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with possibilities and implications that Maria wasn't sure she was ready to explore. Ben was 52 years old, she was 19, and Rosa was 6 months old. They were 3 people thrown together by circumstances, creating a family structure that didn't fit any conventional definition. I don't know. I care about you, obviously. You've been incredibly kind to us, and Rosa adores you. But I also don't want to be a burden or an obligation. I don't want you to feel responsible for taking care of us forever, just because you helped us when we were desperate. Maria, let me be very clear about something. You and Rosa aren't burdens, you're blessings. You brought life back into this house, purpose back into my days, and joy back into my heart. I'm not taking care of you out of obligation. I'm doing it because I love you both. The word hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they were ready to cross. Love in what context? Parental love? Romantic love? The complicated affection of people who'd been through trauma together and emerged stronger on the other side? I love you too, Maria said carefully. Both of you. You and the memory of Sarah and Tommy. This family we've created together. But Ben, I need to know that when I'm ready to make my own choices about my future, you'll support them, even if they take me away from here. Of course I will. My job isn't to keep you here. Maria, my job is to give you and Rosa the foundation you need to build whatever lives make you happiest. Ben's voice carried absolute sincerity. If that means college in Austin or Dallas or anywhere else, if it means a career that requires you to travel, if it means eventually meeting someone your own age and starting a romantic relationship, then I'll support all of it. And if it means staying here, raising Rosa on this ranch, maybe taking classes online or at the community college, being part of whatever this family is becoming, then I'd be honored to have you stay for as long as you want to be here. Rosa chose that moment to throw her remaining toast on the floor, then clap her hands in celebration of her accomplishment. Both adults turned to look at her, and she rewarded their attention with a smile that seemed to contain all the joy in the world. I think she's voting for staying, Maria said, laughing at Rosa's timing. She's got good instincts. They were interrupted by the sound of a vehicle coming up the drive, and Ben moved to the window to check on their visitor. Maria felt the old anxiety flutter in her chest, a reflex left over from months of looking over her shoulder for threats that were no longer coming. It's just Helen Rodriguez, Ben said, recognizing the truck. She probably wants to check on Rosa and make sure we're feeding her properly. Helen Rodriguez had become something of a surrogate grandmother to Rosa, stopping by at least twice a week with baby clothes, toys, and unsolicited advice about child rearing. She'd also become Maria's primary connection to the broader community, introducing her to other young mothers and gradually helping her build a social network beyond the ranch. Morning, Helen, Ben called as the older woman climbed out of her truck carrying a bag that undoubtedly contained more gifts for Rosa. Morning, Ben, Maria. Helen kissed Rosa's forehead and handed her a new stuffed animal, a soft cow that immediately became the baby's primary focus. How's our little princess today? Destructive as usual, Maria said, gesturing toward the breakfast debris scattered around Rosa's chair. She's discovered the joy of throwing food. That's just her exploring her environment. Perfectly normal. Development for a 6-month-old. Helen settled into a chair at the kitchen table, accepting the coffee Ben offered her. I actually came by to talk to you both about something specific. Oh? The church is organizing a fundraiser for the new children's playground, and we'd like to feature Rosa in our promotional materials. You know, local baby who found her forever home kind of thing. Good publicity for the adoption program. shows the community how these stories can have happy endings. Maria felt her stomach clench at the idea of Rosa's story becoming public. They'd managed to keep the details of Carlos Santos' death and the circumstances of their arrival at the ranch relatively quiet, but using Rosa for fundraising would inevitably bring unwanted attention. "Helen, I appreciate the thought, but I'm not sure we want that kind of publicity," Ben said diplomatically. "Rosa's still very young, and Maria's still adjusting to being a single mother." "Oh, I understand. Completely. Privacy is important, especially after everything you've been through." Helen's expression showed genuine concern. "But I also want you to know that this community considers Rosa one of our own now. She's not the baby who fled from violence anymore. She's just Rosa Carter, Ben's daughter and Maria's little sister. And we love her as much as we love any child born here." The casual way Helen used the name Rosa Carter, as if it were already official, sent a warm feeling through Maria's chest. Rosa Carter. It had a nice ring to it, suggesting permanence and belonging in a way that Rosa Santos never had. "We'll think about it," Maria said. "Maybe when she's older and the legal stuff is completely settled." "Of course, dear. No pressure at all." Helen finished her coffee and stood to leave. "I just wanted you to know that when you're ready to share Rosa with the world is ready to love her back." After Helen left, Maria and Ben settled into their usual morning routine. Ben headed out to check on the cattle while Maria cleaned up Rosa's breakfast destruction and prepared for the baby's mid-morning nap. It was domestic and peaceful and utterly ordinary in the best possible way. As Maria rocked Rosa to sleep, she found herself thinking about the future with a sense of anticipation rather than anxiety. For the first time in her life, she had real choices about what came next. She could go to college, pursue a career, travel, meet new people, experience all the things her father's control had denied her. But she could also choose this life, this family, this ranch where Rosa could grow up safe and loved and free to become whoever she wanted to be. She could choose Ben Carter, not as a romantic partner, but as a co-parent and life companion, building something together that was stronger than either could create alone. Rosa fell asleep in her arms, tiny fingers curled around Maria's thumb in a grip that felt like a promise. Whatever choices lay ahead, whatever challenges they might face, this baby would always have a family that chose her, protected her, and celebrated her for exactly who she was. Maria carried Rosa to the nursery, settling her in the crib that had waited so long for a baby to fill it. The room still held traces of the child it had originally been prepared for, but it had been transformed by Rosa's presence into something new and vital. Photos of Rosa's first months covered the walls, documenting her growth from the terrified newborn who'd arrived in the middle of a storm to the happy, healthy baby who now called this ranch home. As Maria closed the nursery door softly behind her, she could hear Ben working in the barn, the sound of normal ranch life continuing steady rhythm. She walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the pasture where Ben's cattle grazed peacefully in the morning sun, at the creek where Carlos Santos had died and where Rosa's new life had truly begun. 6 months ago, Maria Santos had been a frightened teenager fleeing for her life with a baby and $20. Today, Maria Santos Carter was a confident young woman with a future full of possibilities, a baby sister who adored her, and a chosen family that had given her everything she'd never known she needed. The transformation wasn't complete yet. There would be more legal proceedings, more decisions about education and career, and the shape of their unconventional family. But the foundation was solid, built on love and sacrifice, and the radical idea that family could be created by choice rather than dictated by biology. Rosa stirred in her crib, making the small sounds that meant she was settling deeper into sleep. Maria smiled and headed to the living room, where college brochures waited on the coffee table next to Rosa's toys. She had studying to do, a future to plan, and a life to build. For the first time since her mother's death, Maria Santos Carter was looking forward to tomorrow. 3 years had passed since that storm-soaked night when Maria Santos first knocked on Ben Carter's door, and the Iron Creek Ranch had become something neither of them could have imagined during those dark hours of violence and fear. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the pasture where Rosa Carter, now almost 4 years old, chased butterflies between the wildflowers that Maria had planted along the fence line. Rosa had grown into a confident, spirited child whose laughter could be heard across the ranch at any hour of the day. Her dark hair flew behind her as she ran, her small boots leaving prints in the soft earth that would be joined later by the hoofprints of the gentle mare Ben had bought specifically for her 4th birthday. She spoke in the mixture of English and Spanish that came naturally to a child raised in 2 cultures, calling out to the butterflies in both languages as if expecting them to answer back. Maria watched her sister from the porch of the ranch house, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands and textbooks spread across the wooden table where she'd been studying since before dawn. At 22, she had grown into the confident young woman that 18-year-old Maria could never have imagined becoming. Her associate's degree in early childhood education hung framed in the living room, and she was halfway through her bachelor's program at Texas State University, driving to San Marcos 3 days a week for classes while maintaining her responsibilities at the ranch. The transformation had been gradual but profound. The frightened teenager who had fled her father's house with nothing but a baby and $20 had evolved into a woman who spoke at community college orientations about overcoming trauma, who volunteered at the local women's shelter, and who had become something of a local expert on child development and family psychology. Her professors had encouraged her to consider graduate school, perhaps even a doctorate in family therapy, suggesting that her unique background gave her insights that couldn't be learned from textbooks alone. Ben emerged from the barn carrying a bucket of feed for the horses, his movements still strong and purposeful despite the silver that had crept into his hair and the lines that 3 years of laughter had etched around his eyes. At 55, he had found a contentment that had nothing to do with the solitary peace he'd once thought he wanted and everything to do with the chaos and joy that Maria and Rosa had brought to his life. The ranch had prospered under his renewed attention and energy. He'd expanded the cattle operation, added a small herd of horses that he was training for recreational riding, and started offering ranch tours to city families who wanted their children to experience authentic Texas ranch life. Rosa served as his unofficial assistant during these tours, charming visitors with her knowledge of animal care and her complete lack of fear around creatures that outweighed her by hundreds of pounds. "Morning, ladies," Ben called as he approached the porch, pausing to ruffle Rosa's hair as she abandoned her butterfly chase to wrap herself around his legs in the exuberant greeting she gave him every morning. "Uncle Ben, the orange butterfly. Let me get really close today. I think she likes me." "I'm sure she does, sweetheart. Butterflies have excellent taste in friends." Ben lifted Rosa onto his shoulders, a position from which she could survey her domain like a tiny queen. "What do you think we should do today? Can we ride Stella? You promised to teach me how to make her go fast. Trot, not fast. And only if your sister says it's okay." Ben looked toward Maria, who was closing her textbook and marking her place with a highlighter. "How's the studying going? Child psychology final next week. I'm reviewing attachment theories and their applications in trauma recovery." Maria stretched, working out the stiffness from hours of reading. "It's fascinating stuff, actually. Some of the research directly applies to Rosa's development and adjustment. All good news, I hope. Very good news. According to every metric they use to measure childhood resilience, Rosa is thriving. Secure attachment, appropriate social development, above-average cognitive function, and remarkable emotional stability considering her early experiences." Maria smiled at her sister, who was making elaborate plans for the day's horseback riding. Adventure. She's going to be just fine. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar pickup truck coming up the drive, but this time it carried passengers who made Maria's heart race with anticipation. Deputy Jake Morrison climbed out of the driver's seat, his uniform crisp and his badge newly polished, followed by a woman Maria had never seen before, but whose official bearing suggested law enforcement or social services. Rosa immediately scrambled down from Ben's shoulders and ran toward Jake, who had become something of a favorite uncle during his regular visits to the ranch. He'd been promoted to Detective Morrison in the years since that violent night, largely due to his professional handling of the Santos case and his testimony in the subsequent investigations into Carlos Santos' business practices. Detective Jake. Rosa threw herself into his arms with the complete trust of a child who had never known a law enforcement officer to represent anything but safety and protection. Hey there, little bit. How's the ranch's finest cowgirl doing today? I'm learning to ride really fast. Uncle Ben says I have natural balance, whatever that means. It means you're going to be an excellent horsewoman someday. Jake settled Rosa back on her feet and turned toward the adults, his expression carrying the mix of pleasure and business that meant he was there for more than a social call. Ben. Maria, I'd like you to meet Special Agent Catherine Wells from the FBI's Victim Services Division. Agent Wells stepped forward with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to dealing with sensitive situations. She was perhaps 40 years old, with intelligent eyes and the kind of calm demeanor that suggested extensive experience with trauma survivors. She shook hands with both Ben and Maria, her grip firm and professional. Miss Santos, Mr. Carter, I'm very pleased to meet you both. Detective Morrison has told me remarkable things about your family and your recovery from the traumatic events 3 years ago. Maria felt the familiar tension that still arose whenever their past became the focus of official attention. The legal proceedings following Carlos Santos' death had been extensive and sometimes intrusive, requiring her to relive the worst moments of her life for judges, lawyers, and investigators. She'd thought all of that was finally behind them. Is there some kind of problem with our case? Maria asked, unconsciously moving closer to Rosa as if to shield her from whatever official complication had arrived. Quite the opposite, actually. I'm here because your case has become something of a model for how trauma survivors can rebuild their lives when they receive appropriate support and resources. We'd like your permission to include your story in a training program we're developing for law enforcement and social service professionals. Ben and Maria exchanged glances, a form of silent communication they'd developed over years of making decisions together about Rosa's welfare and their family's privacy. Rosa, oblivious to the adult conversation, had returned to her butterfly hunting, her cheerful chatter providing a pleasant background to the more serious discussion. What exactly would that involve? Ben asked, taking the lead in a way that had become natural between them. Primarily, we'd like to document the support systems and interventions that contributed to your family's successful adjustment. Detective Morrison's immediate response, the community support you received, the legal advocacy, and the long-term stability you've created together. It's a remarkable success story that could help other families in similar situations. Would Rosa be involved in any way? Maria's question carried the protective edge that still emerged whenever her sister's welfare was concerned. Not directly. Our focus would be on the adult decision-making and support structures that created the environment for her recovery. We're not interested in exploiting a child's trauma for training purposes. Agent Wells opened a briefcase and withdrew a folder containing what appeared to be academic papers and official documents. I should mention that this request comes with some additional information that you deserve to know about. Our investigation into Carlos Santos' business practices and connections has revealed some disturbing patterns that extend far beyond your family's case. Maria felt her stomach tighten. She'd hoped that Carlos Santos' death had ended their connection to his world of violence and control, but apparently his influence had reached further than she'd realized. What kind of patterns? We've identified at least 12 other families in Texas and Mexico where similar dynamics were occurring. Men who used traditional cultural arguments to justify extreme control over female family members, including several cases where daughters or wives died under suspicious circumstances. Agent Wells' voice carried the careful neutrality of someone discussing horrific facts. Your courage in escaping and seeking help, combined with Detective Morrison's professional response and Mr. Carter's protection, prevented Carlos Santos from continuing his pattern of violence. You mean there were other Rosas? Other babies? Who might have been killed? We believe so. Carlos Santos was part of an informal network of men who shared resources and tactics for maintaining what they called family discipline. Your escape disrupted that network and led to investigations that have since resulted in the rescue of several other children and the prosecution of multiple perpetrators. Rosa chose that moment to return from her butterfly expedition, running up to the group of adults with a flower she'd picked somewhere in the pasture. She offered it to Agent Wells with the generous spirit that characterized all her interactions with new people. This is for you because you look nice and Jake says you help families. Agent Wells accepted the flower with a smile that transformed her professional demeanor into something warm and genuine. Thank you, Rosa. This is beautiful, and you're absolutely right that I try to help families. Do you have little girls too? I do. 2 daughters about your age. I bet they'd love to visit a ranch like this someday. They can come anytime. Uncle Ben gives really good tours, and I can show them how to pet the horses without getting bitten. The easy interaction between Rosa and Agent Wells seemed to settle something in Maria's mind. This woman understood children, respected their autonomy, and approached their welfare with the kind of professional care that Maria had learned to recognize and appreciate. Agent Wells, if our story can help other families avoid what we went through, then I'm willing to participate in your training program. But I have some conditions, of course. What did you have in mind? First, Rosa's identity remains completely protected. No names, no photos, no identifying details that could affect her privacy as she grows up. Second, I want to review any materials before they're used to make sure they accurately represent our experience. And third, I want some involvement in the actual training sessions. That last point is particularly interesting. What kind of involvement were you thinking about? Maria looked at Ben, drawing strength from his encouraging nod. Over the past 3 years, she discovered a passion for advocacy and education that had surprised everyone, including herself. Her experiences had given her insights into trauma recovery that complemented her academic studies, and she'd found that sharing their story in controlled circumstances could be both healing and helpful. I want to help train the people who respond to families in crisis. Law enforcement, social workers, legal advocates, medical professionals. I want them to understand what it feels like to be a 19-year-old girl with no resources and no options, carrying a baby and running for both your lives. I want them to know how important it is to believe victims, to respond quickly, and to think creatively about solutions. And I want them to understand what it means to be the person who opens their door to that girl. Ben added, speaking for the first time since the conversation had begun. Because there are a lot of people out there who could be safe havens for families in crisis, but they don't know how to help or they're afraid of getting involved. Agent Wells was taking notes now, her expression suggesting genuine interest in their perspectives. This is exactly the kind of first-hand insight we were hoping to incorporate into the training. Your willingness to share your expertise could literally save lives. Then we'll do it, Maria said, the decision feeling both momentous and inevitable. But we do it on our terms, in a way that protects Rosa and honors the memory of my mother. The rest of the morning was spent working out the details of their participation in the FBI training program. Agent Wells explained that they were developing a comprehensive curriculum for first responders dealing with domestic violence cases involving children, and that Maria and Ben's story represented one of the most successful outcomes they documented. Detective Morrison contributed his perspective on the law enforcement response, emphasizing how Ben's background as a former sheriff had been crucial in managing the tactical situation while protecting the civilians involved. His testimony would help train other officers in de-escalation techniques and the importance of considering civilian safety in armed confrontations. Rosa, meanwhile, had grown bored with the adult conversation and convinced Ben to start her promised writing lesson. Maria watched through the kitchen window as Ben led the gentle mare around the corral, with Rosa perched confidently in the saddle, her small hands gripping the reins with determination and her face glowing with joy. It was a scene of such profound normalcy and happiness that Maria sometimes had to remind herself it was real. Rosa would grow up thinking this was simply what childhood looked like: patient adults who taught her new skills, animals who responded to her gentle touch, and vast open spaces where she could run and explore without fear. "She's remarkable," Agent Wells observed, following Maria's gaze toward the corral. "You've done an extraordinary job raising her." "We've done an extraordinary job," Maria corrected, including Ben in the acknowledgement. "None of this would have been possible without Ben's willingness to open his home and his heart to strangers. And it wouldn't have lasted without his commitment to treating Rosa as his own daughter from the very beginning. That's not typical, unfortunately. Many temporary placements struggle to provide the kind of stability and emotional security that children need for healthy development." "Ben Carter isn't typical," Maria said, watching as he helped Rosa dismount and praised her progress with genuine enthusiasm. "He's the kind of man who saves people because it's the right thing to do, not because it benefits him. Rosa and I are alive today because he chose to be better than the world expected him to be." Agent Wells closed her notebook and prepared to leave, but she paused at the door with one final question. "Miss Santos, can I ask what you plan to do after you finish your degree? Have you considered a career in social work or victim advocacy?" "Actually, I'm thinking about law school. I want to specialize in family law, maybe become a children's advocate in custody cases involving domestic violence." Maria smiled at the irony of her career aspirations. 3 years ago, I was terrified of the legal system. Now I want to help reform it from the inside. That's a powerful motivation. The legal profession needs people with your background and perspective. After Agent Wells and Detective Morrison left, the ranch settled back into its normal rhythm. Ben finished Rosa's riding lesson and turned his attention to repairing a section of fence that the cattle had damaged during their latest attempt to reach the greener grass on the neighboring property. Maria returned to her studying, but found herself distracted by thoughts of the future and the unexpected directions her life had taken. Rosa napped in the living room, sprawled across the couch with the complete abandon of a thoroughly tired child. She'd fallen asleep clutching the small toy horse Ben had bought her to commemorate her first official riding lesson, her face peaceful and secure in the way that only came from knowing she was completely safe and loved. Looking at her sleeping sister, Maria realized that Rosa would never remember their flight through the Texas night or the violence that had preceded it. She would grow up with stories about brave Uncle Ben who had rescued them from bad people, but those stories would feel like fairy tales rather than lived trauma. Rosa's childhood would be defined by riding lessons and ranch chores, by birthday parties and Christmas mornings, by the ordinary magic of a life lived without fear. That afternoon, Ben found Maria on the front porch with her textbooks, but instead of studying, she was staring out at the pasture where their cattle grazed peacefully in the late afternoon sun. The scene was pastoral and timeless, the kind of landscape that had drawn settlers to Texas for generations. "Penny for your thoughts," Ben said, settling into the rocking chair beside hers. I was thinking about Agent Wells' visit and what it means that our story is considered a success. 3 years ago, success meant simply surviving until morning. Now it means Rosa growing up happy and healthy, me finishing college, you finding purpose again after losing Sarah and Tani. It means family, Ben said simply. Whatever else we've built here, we've built family. But what kind of family are we, exactly? I'm not your daughter, Rosa's not your granddaughter, and we're not romantically involved. We don't fit any of the categories that society uses to define family relationships. Ben was quiet for a moment, considering the question that had come up periodically over the years as they'd navigated the complexities of their unconventional household. Social workers, teachers, and even well-meaning neighbors had sometimes struggled to understand the dynamics of their relationship. I think we're the kind of family that forms when people choose to love each other without conditions or expectations. Rosa is my daughter because I chose to be her father, not because of biology or legal documents. You're my family because we've been through fire together and decided to keep walking in the same direction. And when I graduate and maybe go to law school, when Rosa starts school and makes friends and wants to spend time with families that look more traditional than ours, then we'll adapt and change and keep being family in whatever way works best for everyone involved. That's what families do, Maria. They evolve. Rosa stirred on the couch, waking from her nap with the gradual drowsiness of a child who had spent her energy completely. She appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes and looking for the adults who represented her entire sense of security and belonging. Did I miss anything important? Just grown-up talk about boring stuff, Maria said, opening her arms for Rosa to climb into her lap. How was your nap? I dreamed about flying horses that could carry me all over the ranch really fast. Uncle Ben, do you think horses can really fly? I think horses can do anything they set their minds to, just like little girls who practice really hard and believe in themselves. As the sun began to set over Iron Creek Ranch, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed designed specifically for Texas evenings, Maria felt a deep sense of gratitude for the choices that had brought them to this moment. Carlos Santos had intended to destroy Rosa because she represented everything he feared about change and progress and the loss of traditional power structures. Instead, Rosa had become a symbol of hope and renewal, living proof that love could overcome hatred and that families could be formed by choice rather than dictated by biology. The ranch would continue to prosper under Ben's careful management and Rosa's enthusiastic assistance. Maria would finish her degree and probably attend law school, using her experiences to help other families navigate the legal system during their darkest hours. Rosa would grow up strong and confident and unafraid, carrying her mother's memory and her sister's love into whatever future she chose to create. They were an unconventional family by any standard, brought together by violence but sustained by love, defined not by their shared genetics, but by their shared commitment to each other's welfare and happiness. It wasn't the family any of them had planned, but it was the family they'd chosen, and that made all the difference. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Ben carried a sleeping Rosa to her bedroom while Maria gathered her textbooks and prepared for another evening of studying. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but it would also bring the certainty of their chosen family's continued existence. They had survived the storm and built something beautiful in its aftermath. That was success by any measure. That mattered. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.